So as you heard Pastor saying, we are starting a new sermon series today, and it's a 4-week. It will end on Easter Sunday. So if you come today, I would hope you come for all parts of it, and especially on Easter. That and Christmas should be the 2 Sundays you definitely show up for church, right? Being sarcastic, you should show up every week. But we definitely want you to bring that day friends with you, and we're going to talk about this a little bit in our invitation time, because we're going to do something a little different with invitation. So that will come up here just shortly, but I wanted to get this thing started. So the name of the service is, or name of the message is, Game Changer, How Jesus Turned Setbacks into Triumphs. And specifically, we have broken this down into 4 different areas, and today I'm going to specifically talk about despair. And I wanted to talk quickly here about a basketball player. Who's familiar with basketball? Anybody sports fans? I'm not really good with sports. I played soccer, but I don't watch it, and you might have to revoke my man card. I don't know, but I just don't. I don't sit around waiting for the next game, whatever sport it is. I just don't do that. I'd rather play it or go to a live event. But I can say that I am a little bit familiar with this person that I'm about to talk about, and you might be too. His name, or at least his nickname, was Pistol Pete. Anybody ever heard that name? Pistol Pete. Some of the older folks may, because I'm just kidding. Pistol Pete. I'm just going to dig a hole and just fall backwards. Pistol Pete is a name that is synonymous with basketball. Like I said, I've never really been a huge sports fan, but I remember watching a movie back when I was a kid called The Pistol. Anybody seen that movie? It's about Pistol Pete. And I remember watching that movie, and it taught me about who he was. It starts when he's a little kid and goes up through into his adulthood. And he was famous for trick shots. I mean, he's the original Globetrotter, if we're going to be real. I mean, he had some amazing things that he could do with a ball. But even more so, he was known as having the highest scoring record in the NCAA. He scored 3,667 points. This was before the three-point line, and it was only done in 3 years. That's pretty hot. If anything could be said, having Pistol Pete on your team was a guaranteed game changer. It was just guaranteed. He later went on to play for the NBA, and he played for 3 separate teams. He played for the Atlanta Hawks. He played for the New Orleans Jazz, which I don't think they're even in New Orleans anymore. Are they? They are. See, I don't know anything about basketball. And the Boston Celtics. I definitely know them. Larry Bird. Nice. Unfortunately, Pistol Pete experienced an injury while he was playing with the NBA, and after 10 years of playing in the NBA, he had to retire because he was never able to really fully recover from that injury. But he retired as a legend of basketball, and he was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. Now, by all accounts, it's pretty successful, I would imagine, right? However, after retiring, Pistol Pete, in the light of all that he accomplished, became severely depressed. He became severely hopeless. He became a recluse, and he began to chase after things in life to try and satisfy the hunger and longing to fill that void in his heart. He was miserable. In fact, he battled alcoholism, and he even became suicidal. You see, he felt he had lost his purpose as a human being. His entire image was wrapped up in being a basketball player, and when he lost that, he fell into a pit of despair. But one night in 1982, that's a good year, by the way, 1982. That's the year I was born, and Robert, and Rachel. See, 3 good things happened that year. 1982. He knelt down beside his bed, and in the middle of the night, he asked Jesus to come into his life. In fact, a couple years before his death, he was quoted as saying, "I want to be remembered as a Christian, a person that serves him to my utmost, not as a basketball player." That's an interesting thing to say, wouldn't you think? Somebody who was in the Hall of Fame, somebody who scored 3,667 points in 3 years in college, is saying, I don't want to be remembered for that. I want to be remembered for being a servant of Christ. After he became a Christian, he went on to start his own basketball camps where he taught 3 disciplines. The first and foremost was faith. The second one was basketball, and the third was nutrition. So he would go in and he would teach little kids about these 3 things: faith, basketball, and nutrition. And he would tell the campers about his testimony. That was like the first thing he would do at every camp he conducted. He would tell them how Jesus changed his life. And it actually drew the attention of the folks like Billy Graham, who began to invite him to come and speak at some of his crusades. He also went on to speak in other churches, prisons, and he even gave his testimony when he was being inducted into the Hall of Fame. How about that? Now that's a stage. You see, when Jesus came into Pistol Pete's life, he experienced a game changer. Suddenly, the things he had accomplished in his career in basketball, which, trust me, those things are amazing, paled in comparison to what Jesus brought into his life. Unfortunately, in 1988, he died during a pickup basketball game in a church out in California. He had a heart issue from birth that apparently was not discovered until he died. In fact, the doctor was dumbfounded at how he survived this long. But when I look at that and I say, what a fitting place for Pistol Pete to die. Play in the game he loves, in the house of the Lord he loves. See, it wasn't, I'm sure it had obvious effects on his family. He had very young children at the time. But I just felt like that was just like, if you could go, that's the way to go. Loving on God and playing the sport you love. You see, Jesus was his game changer, not the Hall of Fame, not the 3,667 points that he scored in college, not the basketball tricks that he was able to do when he was playing high school ball. None of these things were the game changer. Jesus himself, when he was an adult, changed his life. Which brings us to the title of our message, How Jesus Turned Setbacks into Triumphs. But if we're going to talk about being a game changer, we're talking about things having a game changer, I think we need to first define what game changer is. So let's do that. Game changer. A newly introduced element or factor that changes an existing situation or activity in a significant way. A game changer changes the way that something is done, thought about, or made. And in the case of Pistol Pete Maravich, his life experienced a game changer at the deepest moment of despair in his life. Jesus came in and he turned what he thought was a setback into a triumph that had far more reaching impact than probably his basketball playing would have ever accomplished. You see, Jesus wants to come in and he wants to rock our world. He's not settled with just sitting on the sidelines cheering you on. He wants to get in the game. He wants to come in, he wants to turn everything on end so that we can be victorious in everything that we put our hands to. That is what Jesus wants to do. And any amount of time spent living in this world is going to show you that this world is going to throw every and any monkey wrench it can possibly throw into the gears of life. But here's what Jesus said in John 16:33. He said, I have told you all of this so that you may have peace in who? Me. Here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. You see, he didn't promise we wouldn't have setbacks. That's not what he said. He made no bones about it. We will have setbacks. We will experience despair. But he also promised that we would find peace in him because he's already overcome all of that. And that's a promise worth holding on to. In other words, he wants to meet us in our despair, in our setbacks, and he wants to become victorious in spite of those things. So I think we're going to really begin to see how Jesus can do that when we begin to examine Mark chapter 9 here. We're going to look at verses 14 through 29, but we'll do that in a minute. But here, just a quick kind of summary, if you will. We see a father who is in this pit of despair. We see a father who is desperate, who's seeking out someone who can bring his son out from being demon-possessed. That's what's going on here in Mark 9. And in order to cover all of this, we're going to kind of break this up because it's a long section. We're going to look at verses 14 through 29, but I want to look at all of them. But we're going to break these up, and we're going to talk about this individually here. And we're going to discuss how despair can lead to a game changer. The first point is this, and this might be a duh, but everyone will experience despair. No one is exempt. Let's look at verses 14 through 18. When they returned to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd surrounding them, and some teachers of religious law were arguing with them. And when the crowd saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with awe, and they ran to greet him. "What is all this arguing about?" Jesus asked. One of the men in the crowd spoke up and said, "Teacher, I brought my son so you could heal him. He is possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk. And whenever the spirit seizes him, it throws him violently to the ground. Then he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast out the evil spirit, but they couldn't do it." So that's what they're arguing about right now. As a father, I can only imagine how heart-wrenching it must be to watch helplessly as your little son is being tormented by a demon. I can only imagine that he must have felt utterly useless, so much so he was like, "Anybody, somebody, please help me." Can you imagine the depth of emotion and despair that this father was feeling? I can. At least to a certain degree. I never had to seek help in getting one of my children exercised, thankfully. However, I have had to sit back and watch as my child suffered through something, and I sat there feeling completely helpless. When Riley was about 1.5 years old, I'm glad she's not in here. She'll hear it later. She likes to actually listen to the sermons later, and Sherry puts it on YouTube, and they sit there and watch. So she'll get to hear this. So Riley was 1.5 years old, and we were up in North Carolina at a church there, and it was a Sunday night, and we were having a youth movie night. I'm pretty sure we were watching like The Lord of the Rings or something, having a Lord of the Rings marathon, extended version, as if 3.5 hours wasn't long enough per movie. And we're up there, and we're watching these movies, and we were in the sanctuary, and we had screens up kind of like this. It was a similar situation, sanctuary size-wise. And Riley, I was sitting on the front row. Riley was maybe 3 or 4 rows behind me, sitting beside one of the youth. And I hear, and I was like, what just happened? And I turned around, and Riley's crying, and one of the youth was going, "I don't know." And I'm like, oh no. And I go back there. And it's dark, okay, so you have to understand it's dark. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe she just bonked her head. She was like crawling underneath the pews and just nailed her noggin or something. So I'm expecting a knot, right? And I pick her up and I bring her into the light, and it's like Niagara Falls of blood coming from her chin area, lit right around in here. Immediately I was like, oh, that's not good. She was wearing a nice little yellow dress, which I'm pretty sure is in the trash now. And I just took it, and I lifted it up over her mouth, and I applied it, and I ran out the back. With all the teenagers still sitting in here. And and as I'm running out, fortunately I had some youth workers with me who were sitting there, and one of them's like, "I will drive. The other ones will stay here and watch the kids." And I said, "Great." And so I jumped in the back of their car, and I'm just riding along, and I'm like, I need to call Sherry. She worked at Starbucks, and she's over there at Starbucks. And I was like, I got to call her so she at least knows. And I call her, and I'm like, hey, Sherry, I don't want you to freak out. We're going to the hospital. What do you think she did? She freaked out. She went into full-on mother panic mode. She says, I'm leaving work. My daughter's going to the hospital. They're like, go. And she jumps in her car, which was only a couple blocks from the hospital. And she meets us there. And we get into the hospital. It's like a huge waiting room full of disease and everything else. And I'm going, ugh. And we sit down. And by the time we kind of got checked in and everything, Riley's feeling good now. She's like, I'm good now. And she's like, can I play with, she wanted to play with the other little kids. I was like, we don't know what they have. Don't know. You have an open wound. We don't know. But it was there we were finally able to sit down because we had a long time to wait for the doctor to come because we were not of the most important emergency going on. And so I began to look at her mouth, and I'll tell you what, it's not good when you can see her teeth through here. That's not good. That's not healthy. That doesn't seem normal. And I'm like, oh. So we finally get back into the back room. The doctor pulls us in. We go back there. We're sitting down. Doctor comes in. He's like, okay, so here's what we're going to do. I'm not going to stitch it up, but I'm going to use this super glue stuff. And I'm like, sweet. That's way better. I don't even want to watch you stick needles in her face. And so he comes in. He gets all set up. He calls a nurse in. He lays her on her back. She's okay for now. And he goes in, and he has to pinch it closed. And as he's beginning to do that, suddenly my little 1.5-year-old becomes a 40-year-old man and starts flailing. And he's like, holy cow. So the nurse comes over, and she's holding Riley down, and he tries it again. And I mean, she goes from 40-year-old man to a 40-year-old Arnold Schwarzenegger. And we're like, oh, this is not good. So I go over there, and I'm like, all right, I'll help. So I'm like holding Riley's shoulders down, and the nurse has Riley's feet, and the doctor's over her face. And all I could think is, I want to punch the doctor right in the nose. Because I'm watching him, and I'm feeling like he's not actually helping my child. You know, I've never seen her turn into Arnold Schwarzenegger. This is not normal for her. Clearly the doctor's doing something wrong, and he needs my fist to correct it. But I chose not to punch him, and I allowed him to finish his job. And when he was done, we looked at her, and I was like, I don't see your teeth through your face anymore. And she was happy. They gave her a sucker or something. We got in the car, we went home, and all was well once more in the Bates house. My little Hulk Hogan became a little girl again. I could tell you that while my situation was different than the man in Mark 9, that as a father, there is no feeling like that. There just isn't. And that's exactly what's going on here. The disciples were trying to help. They're like, we're going to help you, sir. And I think they only made matters worse. Now, unfortunately, unlike the doctor, they didn't know what they were doing. The doctor knew what he was doing. And you see, as they're kind of going back and forth here about what's going on, the disciples and him begin to argue over what just happened. And I think any father would do that. That's why, like I said, I wanted to punch the doctor in the face. He's going, you guys aren't helping my kids. My kid is in trouble. And you just made matters worse. He is feeling desperate. See, the reality is we're all going to experience a moment like that. Perhaps several moments like that. And for some, long moments like that. But God doesn't desire for us to live in and obsess over our situation. He desires that we're going to be free from those things. And in Matthew chapter 11, 28 through 30, he says this, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humbled and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give is light." Which leads us to the next point, which is desperation can lead you to seek out a game changer. You see, while Jesus wants us to take on his yoke, his burden, which is indeed light, our burden, our desperation is what leads us to seek that out. It seems kind of weird, doesn't it? But it's kind of like people with serious addiction. You know, addicts will never actually go get help until they actually realize they need help. You can sit there and be like, dude, you need help. You are messed up. And they're just going to look at you and go, dude, I'm fine. I got this. And they will keep doing that until they get to a place where they no longer can put on a front. And they go, I need help. But being in despair doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lack of hope. The Russian composer, pianist, and I'm going to try not to butcher this name, Dmitri Shostakovich, put it this way: when a man is in despair, it means that he still believes in something. And I believe that's the case with the father in Mark 9. So while he was in despair, his despair drove him to seek out help, which meant that he still believed that there was a solution and that there was somebody out there who could help him. Otherwise, why would he have sought out the help, right? So let's look back at verses 17 through 18. It says, one of the men in the crowd spoke up. This is the father. He said, "Teacher, I brought my son so you could heal him. He is possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk. And whenever the spirit seizes him, it throws him violently to the ground. Then he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast out the evil spirit, but they couldn't do it." You see, this father was so desperate that he sought out someone who could fix the situation. And if you look at it, he said, "I was seeking you," right? He was seeking Jesus. He knew who he was looking for. But he came up to the disciples first. And so he settled, right? All right. Well, they're saying, "We can help you." And he's like, "Okay." And I can imagine that when this father approaches the disciples for help, that maybe for just a moment he begins to think to himself, this is it. This is the moment. I'm finally going to get the help I need. Have you ever been in a place like that? Have you ever been so desperate that you're going to take help from anybody? But then either the help you get isn't actually very helpful, or the people you reach out to turn out to be just as helpless as you are. I know I have. When I took the worship leader job in the church in North Carolina, that I've mentioned many, many, many times, and you'll probably hear many, many, many more times, because it's a big part of my life. It was only 2 years, but it was a big part of my life. Anyway, Sherry and I took the job there because we were in a desperate place. We had just had Riley. We were both unemployed, and we were living with my parents, and nothing against my parents. My mom's sitting right here. But that's not exactly the situation any new parent really has the desire to be in when they're beginning a new family. Which leads, we were desperate to get out on our own and provide for our family, and the church in North Carolina fit the bill by all external reasoning. And desperation led us to seek out a game changer for our situation, which leads us to the next point, which is, don't settle for anything less than Jesus. Hear me when I say this. Your pastor is helpful. I hope I'm helpful. I hope pastor's helpful. Your life group and your life group leaders are helpful. Your family can be helpful, hopefully. Your spouse can be hopeful, or at least they better be. Your friends can be helpful, but if your hope rests in them, you're going to be let down. Your hope has to be in nothing less than Jesus himself. Your desperation should not lead you to settle for anything less than Jesus. This doesn't mean that Jesus couldn't or wouldn't use others to help you in your time of need, because that's often how it works, right? He sends the help, right? It just means that you cannot allow your desperation to overshadow the voice of God in your situation to the point where you settle. And back in 1991, one of America's greatest lyrical composers wrote this: "Anything less than the best is a felony." And that was Vanilla Ice. He got so much wrong, but he got that right. Anything less than the best is a felony. But when it comes to Jesus, anything less than Jesus should be a felony. But in reality, it's missing the mark altogether. And looking back on my family's move to North Carolina, it's hard to say now, even still, it's hard to say whether or not God actually led us there or if we were just so desperate that we settled. You know, I battle that daily. I'm like, was that even a God move, or were we just so desperate to take care of ourselves that we just settled? And I'd be wrong to say that good things didn't come out of that situation. After all, we met some great people there. We developed more in the ministry, for good or bad. Mostly good. It's kind of a gold in the fire thing, refining me, mostly me, less on Sherry. And my time there actually helped us get to Legacy Church. In fact, my time there actually helped lead Legacy Church to the person that helped us get into the hotel that we met in for 2 years. I'd go through that, but that's a really long story. But I can tell you this, once we got there, within 3 months, things seemed just as helpless as they were when we were living back home with my parents. So much so that I began to put my resume out. I'm like, Lord, get us out of here. This was a mistake. And we were there for 2 years. If I were to try and categorize our situation based on my feelings, I'd have to say that we settled. Because I'm going to be honest, it wasn't a situation that, had I been thinking clearly, looking at the situation clearly, I probably would not have accepted. But I had a wife, I had a child, and the situation dictated I needed a job. And I took it. But let's bring this back to the scripture that we're going through. The father of Mark 9 settled for the disciples when he was actually looking for Jesus. We know that. He said, I was looking for you, but your disciples tried to help me. He let his desperation overshadow the fact that he was actually out looking for Jesus. He wasn't looking for the disciples. But because he was so desperate, he let them give it a go. And they failed miserably. And unfortunately, as it does for most of us when we settle, it only serves to frustrate our situation, doesn't it? For the father of Mark 9, the situation definitely got frustrated. And is clearly seen in verse 14 when Jesus walks up and they're having a big argument. You know, what's going on, guys? They're arguing. That was not a peaceful moment. But as we soon find out, there was more missing than just Jesus from the equation. Which leads us to the final point, which is sometimes our faith needs a jump start. We'll look at verses 19 through 24. It says, Jesus said to them, you faithless people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? That doesn't sound very Jesus-y. That was very not nice. Then he says, bring the boy to me. So they brought the boy. But when the evil spirit saw Jesus, it threw the child into a violent convulsion, and he fell to the ground, writhing and foaming at the mouth. How long has this been happening? Jesus asked the father. He replied, since he was a little boy. The spirit often throws him into the fire or into water, trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can. I love Jesus. What do you mean, if I can? You have to put that in there. Because I don't think he just turned it on. What do you mean, if I can? What do you mean, if I can? Anything is possible if a person believes. And the father instantly cried out, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. I think it's safe to say at this point that Jesus himself was the game changer for this moment, right? Only he can turn our situations upside down or upside right, however you look at it. But in every occasion of healing, exorcism, or whatever else, other miracles you see Jesus doing, there was always two parts to the equation. It was one part Jesus and one part faith, right? Jesus plus faith equals miracle. Einstein didn't have to figure that out. So Jesus walks into the situation and he shakes things up. But he recognizes that faith is missing. And in verse 19, he calls everybody out. Again, that's not very nice, Jesus. And as you recall, we talked about faith in our last sermon series, All Access. Recall that? And we discovered that faith is the currency of the kingdom, and it's how things get accomplished. It's how miracles happen. That's what faith does. Now, again, here's my favorite part of the story. Let's look at 22 and 23 again. The Spirit often throws him into the fire or into water, trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can. What do you mean, if I can? Jesus asked. Anything is possible if a person believes. I just love what Jesus does there. He says, what do you mean, if I can? Hello, Son of God. He was the game changer. What do you mean, if he can do it? Of course he can do it. But he didn't stop there. He goes on to say, anything is possible if a person believes. Folks, he's talking about faith. How often do we approach our situations like this man? How often when we pray do we say something like, Lord, if it's your will, you'll heal me, or whoever we're praying for. If it's your will. Lord, if you do this for me, I will do this for you. If you do this, Lord, if only you hear us, Lord, if this and that. I'm guilty of this. I've done it a lot. I'm not above it. And if I think we were all honest here, we've all done it. But you know what? I think when Jesus is hearing our prayers and we say, if you can, he's screaming, what do you mean, if? Do we not believe that he's the Son of God? Do we not believe that he is who he says he is and he will do what he says he will do? We have to stop letting the ifs dictate our faith and start letting his promises prove our faith. But let's be real. Sometimes faith is hard to come by. I'm not going to pretend. It's hard to come by sometimes. It's hard to have faith, especially when that despair seems really thick. And I think the Father, he desperately wants to have faith. Otherwise, he wouldn't have sought out Jesus to begin with, right? He wanted it. But he was so hopeless that all he can say is, I do believe, but help me in my unbelief. I do believe, but help me in my unbelief. That seems kind of contradictory. I do believe, but help me believe. How can he say that? I think it's because in his heart he really did want to believe. I think he really desperately wanted to believe, but he just needed to have his faith jump-started. He needed help getting to the place where his mind and his heart could meet in that beautiful place called faith. And in verses 25 through 27, we see that Jesus goes on to heal the boy, and the father and son finally find peace. You see, sometimes we're looking for the game changer in all sorts of places except the right place. There's only one person who can wreck our situation in a good way. And that person is Jesus. He is the game changer. No matter our situation, when he comes into the picture, the game changes. Even when things seem bleak, even when darkness settled in, Jesus walks in and he changes the game. Dude, he invented the rules. Who's to say he can't bend the rules? For the disciples in this story, they were having a hard time understanding why they were unable to free the boy. And in verses 28 through 29, it says this, Afterward, when Jesus was alone in the house of his disciples, they asked him, Why couldn't we cast out that evil spirit? And Jesus replied, This kind can only be cast out by prayer. You see, the presence of Jesus and the activation of our faith absolutely helped free the boy and change the game for the father and son. But for the disciples, what was missing was not only faith, but prayer. As many of you are aware, as a church, we are trying to recultivate an atmosphere of prayer. We've changed up prayer time. We've done things a little differently. We've begun to work it a little differently, get away from some things, and really begin to buckle down and focus on prayer. That, I believe, was an aspect in the disciples' life that was missing. They didn't have a lifestyle of prayer. And they've seen Jesus do all sorts of miracles. In fact, they know what he's capable of. They know, they've been with him this whole time. But they lacked the prayer discipline to handle some situations, some very desperate situations. And too often we are like this as well. We come face to face with despair, and rather than seek Jesus in prayer, we try to find our own solution. We try to figure things out on our own. I am the worst at this. You can ask my wife. In so many situations, Sherry has gotten onto me for not praying about the situation because I'm a fixer. Anybody a fixer? Somebody looks at you and they start telling you about your problems. You're like, you know what you need to do? This is what you need to do. That's me. Sherry's like, I'm having a hard day. The kids are doing this and that. I said, you know what you need to do? You need to make the kids clean the house. That's what you need to do. And she's like, shut up. I don't need you to tell me what I need to do. I just need you to listen. And too often, that's what I've done. Get to a desperate situation. And I'll be honest, I get offended at her all the time when she does that. I'm like, really? What kind of person do you think? You think I don't know Jesus? You don't think I pray to Jesus? Who do you think you are? Well, she's right. She's right. She's right. I forsake it way too much. I often start running through my brain. We're getting tight on finances. She's like, we need to pray about it. And I'm like, no, actually, we just need to make a budget. We got a budget, but we need to tighten up that budget. That's what we could do. If we just start working, she's like, shut up. Pray about it. And I'm like, that's too easy. Well, then do it. If it's so easy, then do it. Problem is prayer requires me to stop relying on myself and start relying on Jesus to handle my situation. And my pride gets in the way as a father and as a husband who wants to take care of my family. I'm like, Jesus, don't come up in here, man. I got this under control. I don't. But prayer is a powerful thing. And I find that when I actually do pray, this is weird. I don't even know why. It really should be an indicator. Brad, hello, you should pray some more. But there's been situations where I'm like, Sherry's like, I'm talking to her, I'm like, man, we need a sound system. Our sound system's getting... And she's like, pray about it. And I'm like, yeah, but if I just start, maybe if I price some things out and I talk to Pastor, maybe he'll pray about it. Fine. So I pray about it, and a week later, no lie, folks, the sound system you see right here landed in my lap. I wasn't looking for it. Started on a Sunday, praying. No, sorry, was it what, Thursday? Thursday, praying for it. Sunday morning, we go to church, and an individual comes up to me and says, Pastor Brad, can we take you out to lunch? I said, sure. We go out to lunch, we sit down, and he goes, hey, I wanted to talk to you about something. I said, yeah, what is it? He goes, I want to give you a sound system. I'm like, this is a joke, right? And I was like, what kind of, I'm thinking like, oh gosh, if it's any worse than the one we got. And he's like, well, let me tell you about it. He starts telling me about it, and I'm going, I wanted that soundboard and that sound system for years. It literally fell into my lap. You would think God would say, or I would say, all right, God, I get it, prayer. But too often times, I still want to do it myself. I'm going to close with this quick illustration, and as I read it, Actually, no, we're not going to do the praise team. I take it back. If you want to, cue up something nice. I don't know how to word that any other way. I don't want thumping. How about that? Something nice. During the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, German pastor Paul Gerhardt and his family were forced to flee from their home. One night as they stayed in a small village inn, homeless and afraid, his wife broke down and cried openly in despair. To comfort her, Gerhardt reminded her of scripture promises that God had given about provision and keeping. Then, going out to the garden to be alone, he broke down and wept. He felt he had come to his darkest hour. Soon afterward, he felt the burden lift. And he sensed a new presence of the Lord. And taking his pen, he wrote the following hymn. Give to the winds thy fears, hope, and be undismayed. God hears thy sighs and counts thy tears. God shall lift up thy head. Through waves and clouds and storms, he gently clears the way. Wait thou his time, so shall the night soon end in joyous day. It is often in our darkest times that God makes his presence known. He uses our suffering and our troubles to show us that he is the only source of strength. And when we see this truth like the pastor Gerhardt, we receive a new hope. And so my question to you, church, is this today. Are you facing a great trial? If so, take heart. Put yourself in God's hands. Wait for his timing, and he too will give you a song in the night. Release the